At my son's wedding, his mother-in-law said loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's not a proper mother-in-law. That's a mistake in discount clothes." The bride laughed and clapped like a seal at feeding time. But my son didn't laugh. He stood up, called off the wedding in front of everyone, and did something that destroyed their family fortune the next day. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Now, let me tell you how we got to this beautiful disaster. Because, honey, this story is about as sweet as revenge gets. 6 months before that glorious train wreck of a wedding, I was living my quiet little life in Millbrook, Iowa, thinking my biggest problem was whether to plant tulips or daffodils in my front garden. At 62, I'd perfected the art of being exactly what people expected. A widow living comfortably on my late husband's modest pension, driving my sensible Honda Civic and making casseroles for church potlucks. What they didn't know was that my modest lifestyle was about as real as Chloe's future marriage was going to be. My son, Andrew, had been dating this Chloe Pemberton for 8 months, and I'd met her exactly twice before she started planning their engagement like she was organizing a military invasion. The first time was at Andrew's birthday dinner, where she spent the entire evening photographing her salad for something called Instagram, while asking me pointed questions about my financial security as I aged. Charming girl, really. The second meeting was when she brought her mother, Vivian Pemberton, to get to know Andrew's family better. Vivian swept into my modest little house like she was touring a homeless shelter, making helpful suggestions about updating my decor and asking if I'd considered downsizing to something more manageable. Meanwhile, Chloe was in my kitchen opening cabinets and drawers like she was conducting a home inspection. "Mrs. Whitman," Vivian had said, settling into my late husband's recliner like she owned it. "We're just so thrilled that Andrew found someone who understands the importance of family support systems." She smiled, that sharp little smile that wealthy women perfect by age 40. It's wonderful when older family members can contribute what they can, even if it's just emotional support. I nearly choked on my tea. Here I was, being patted on the head like a good little grandmother who might be useful for babysitting someday. If she only knew that I'd been watching my stock portfolio grow for the past 8 years, while she was probably spending her husband's money on whatever rich wives buy to fill their empty days. Andrew, bless his heart, was completely oblivious to the undercurrents. He was so in love he couldn't see that Chloe looked at our family like we were a charity case she'd graciously adopted. And honestly, I was almost impressed by her performance. The girl had studied us like we were a science project, determined to figure out exactly how much we were worth and how she could best manage us. But here's what Chloe and her delightful mother didn't understand about small-town Iowa widows. We didn't survive the farm crisis, 3 recessions, and various family dramas by being stupid. We just let people think we are, because it's amazing what folks will say when they think you're harmless. You see, my dear soon-to-be daughter-in-law had made one crucial error in her research about Andrew's family background. She'd never asked about my maiden name or bothered to look into what I'd been doing with my time since Harold passed 8 years ago. 8 years of careful planning, 8 years of strategic investing, 8 years of building something substantial, while everyone assumed I was just another widow, counting pennies and clipping coupons. Harold had always encouraged my interest in the stock market. Even when we were younger and money was tight, he'd say, "Dorothy, you've got a mind for numbers." When my life insurance comes through someday, you're going to do something brilliant with it. He believed in me more than I believed in myself back then. When Harold passed, the grief nearly broke me. But after the funeral, flowers wilted, and the casseroles from well-meaning neighbours stopped arriving. I found myself sitting at our kitchen table with a cheque for $200,000 and a decision to make. I could live modestly on his pension and Social Security, or I could honour Harold's faith in my financial instincts. I chose to honour Harold. 3 weeks after Chloe's condescending phone call about their engagement plans, I was sitting in my accountant's office reviewing my annual financial statements when I realised exactly how I was going to handle my future daughter-in-law's superior attitude. The numbers on the page were quite satisfying. 8 years of careful investing had turned Harold's life insurance payout into something considerably more substantial than anyone in Millbrook suspected. Mrs. Whitman, my accountant, James Burlington, said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed my portfolio. You've done remarkably well with these investments. Your current net worth has reached $1.2 million. I smiled and nodded like this was routine information, but inside I was doing a little victory dance. My late husband, Harold, had always said I had a good head for numbers, and apparently he'd been right. While everyone assumed I was living on his pension and Social Security, I'd been quietly building a fortune that would have made Vivian's mother soil her designer panties. My investment strategy had been simple but effective. I'd started conservative with index funds and municipal bonds, then gradually moved into real estate investment trusts and carefully selected growth stocks. I'd reinvested every dividend, lived below my means, and watched compound interest work its magic year after year. Harold would have been so proud. The plan started forming in my mind like a beautiful, terrible flower blooming in spring. Andrew called that afternoon, voice bright with excitement. Mom, Chloe's parents want to meet you properly before the wedding. They're planning a little dinner party next weekend. Nothing fancy, just immediate family. How lovely, I said, already imagining what I'd wear to this nothing fancy dinner party. Will it be at their home? Their estate, actually. Chloe says it's been in the family for generations. I guess they have quite a bit of property out in West Hills. Andrew paused. Mum, I should probably mention that the Pembertons are, well, they're pretty wealthy. Charles owns several businesses, and Vivian comes from old money. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable or anything. Sweet boy. He was actually worried about me feeling out of place among rich people. If he only knew that I'd been getting investment advice from the same financial advisors who managed portfolios for half the wealthy families in Iowa. If he only knew that I'd spent the last 8 years quietly building an empire, while his future in-laws assumed I was just another aging widow they needed to manage and control. I'm sure I'll be fine, dear, I assured him. I'll just be myself. And that was exactly what I intended to do. The Pemberton estate turned out to be one of those sprawling colonial mansions that screamed, my great-grandfather made this fortune during the Industrial Revolution, and we've been coasting on it ever since. The circular driveway could have parked a dozen cars, and the front garden looked like something from a magazine. Spread about gracious living, ancient oak trees framed the property like sentinels, and the manicured hedges were so perfect they looked artificial. I pulled up in my Honda Civic behind Andrew's modest Toyota, both of us looking like we'd gotten lost on the way to the servants' entrance. The contrast was almost comical. Our two practical vehicles dwarfed by the sheer grandeur of the estate's entrance. I could practically hear the judgment in the very air. Chloe emerged from the front door wearing what I suspected was a $500 cocktail dress, her smile so bright it could have powered the house's exterior lighting. Her jewelry caught the afternoon sun, diamonds that sparkled with the kind of fire that only comes from serious money. "Mrs. Whitman," she called, air-kissing me like we were long-lost relatives. "Welcome to our family home. Mother and Daddy are so excited to meet you properly." The interior was all marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of furniture that costs more than most people's cars. Everything gleamed with the patina of old money, the kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself because it's been established for generations. Persian rugs covered floors that probably cost more to install than my entire annual budget for household expenses. Vivian Pemberton glided down the grand staircase, wearing pearls that probably cost more than Andrew's annual salary, her husband Charles trailing behind. Like a well-dressed shadow, she moved with the practiced grace of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, never questioned whether she belonged in rooms like this. "Dorothy," Vivian said, taking my hands like she was blessing me with her touch. "How wonderful to finally have a proper visit. Chloe has told us so much about Andrew's family." I'll bet she had. The way Vivian's eyes swept over my simple dress and sensible shoes told me exactly what Chloe had shared about Andrew's humble background. I could practically see the mental notes being taken. Modest income, small-town values, probably struggling to make ends meet on a widow's pension. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 20 people comfortably, though it was just the 6 of us around one end of their mahogany table. The table itself was a work of art, polished to a mirror shine and set with china that probably had its own insurance policy. Crystal glasses caught the light from an elaborate chandelier that cast rainbow reflections across the pristine white tablecloth. The conversation flowed like expensive wine, with Vivian and Charles sharing stories about their recent trip to Europe, while Chloe hung on every word like they were recounting the secrets of the universe. They spoke casually about private jets and 5-star hotels, dropping names of exclusive resorts and restaurants that existed in a world far removed from my daily reality in Millbrook. "We just adore traveling," Vivian explained, cutting into what I suspected was very expensive steak. "Last year, we did the Mediterranean, and this spring we're planning something special for Charles's 60th birthday. Perhaps a private villa in Tuscany." "How lovely," I said, taking a sip of wine that probably cost more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a week. Travel is so broadening. The wine was exceptional, I had to admit, smooth and complex, with layers of flavour that spoke to careful aging and expert selection. I found myself appreciating the craftsmanship even as I bristled at the casual way they discussed expenses that would represent months of income for most families. Chloe leaned forward eagerly, her eyes bright with what she probably thought was generous condescension. "Mrs. Whitman, Andrew mentioned you've never been outside the Midwest. We were thinking that after the wedding, you might enjoy visiting us when we take trips. You know, as family." The condescension was so thick, you could have cut it with the silver butter knife sitting beside my plate. Here they were, generously offering to include the poor little small-town grandmother in their glamorous lifestyle, probably expecting me to weep with gratitude at their charity. The way she said, "as family," made it clear that I would be the dependent relative they graciously included in their adventures. "That's very thoughtful," I replied, wondering how they'd react to learning that I'd been considering buying a vacation home in Florida with my investment returns. I'd actually been looking at properties near Sarasota, places with golf courses and boat slips that would have impressed even the Pembertons. But the real show began when Charles started talking about his business empire. 3 car dealerships, 2 restaurants, and what he called various other investments that were apparently doing quite well. He had that particular swagger that wealthy men get when they're showing off for someone they consider beneath them, explaining market strategies and business principles like he was teaching a kindergarten class. His voice took on the patronizing tone of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, at least in his own mind. He gestured with his wine glass as he spoke, clearly enjoying the opportunity to educate the simple widow about the complexities of wealth management. The key to success, he informed me, gesturing with his wine glass, is understanding that money makes money. Most people never figure that out. They work for wages their whole lives instead of making their capital work for them. I nodded thoughtfully, as if this was the first time I'd ever heard such wisdom, while mentally calculating that my portfolio had probably outperformed his various investments by at least 15% over the past 3 years. His various other investments sounded suspiciously like the kind of scattered approach that looked impressive, but lacked the focused strategy that had made my own portfolio so successful. The irony was delicious. Here was Charles Pemberton, lecturing me about making money work while I sat there with a portfolio that had consistently outperformed the market average. Harold would have found this moment hilarious, his quiet wife being lectured about financial strategy by someone who probably couldn't match her returns if he tried. That's when Vivian delivered the line that sealed their fate. "Dorothy, dear," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "I hope you don't feel intimidated by all this wealth. We want you to know that we don't expect Andrew's side of the family to contribute equally to the wedding expenses. We understand your limitations." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on their precious marble floors. The words hung in the air like a slap, and I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. It was like a door slamming shut on the last 8 years of playing the humble widow, and another door opening onto something much more interesting. "How considerate of you," I said, setting down my wine glass with what I hoped was appropriate gratitude. I wouldn't want to overextend myself financially. Andrew looked mortified, and I almost felt sorry for him. The poor boy had no idea he was about to become collateral damage in what was shaping up to be the most educational experience the Pemberton family had ever encountered. His face had gone pale, and I could see him struggling with the urge to defend me while trying not to create a scene at his future in-laws' dinner table. Chloe jumped in quickly, probably sensing the temperature drop in the room. "What Mother means is that we want everyone to be comfortable. We've already handled the major expenses, and we understand that different families have different circumstances." Different circumstances. Right. Like my circumstances didn't include a portfolio worth more than their annual household income. Like my circumstances didn't include 8 years of strategic planning that had outperformed every investment Charles had bragged about during dinner. Charles nodded sagely, like he was solving world peace. "The important thing is that we're all family now. Money shouldn't come between family members." Easy for him to say, considering he'd just spent 10 minutes bragging about his net worth while explaining basic investment principles to the simple widow like I'd never heard of compound interest. The condescension was so thick I could taste it, metallic and bitter on my tongue. I smiled and made appropriate murmurs of agreement while planning exactly how I was going to educate this charming family about assumptions and circumstances. Because, you see, the Pemberton family had just made the kind of mistake that rich people make when they've been rich for so long. They forget that other people might have working brain cells. They'd assumed that modest meant poor and quiet meant stupid. They were about to learn the difference. After dinner, Vivian insisted on giving me the full tour of their family home, which was really just an opportunity to show off their art collection, their library full of leather-bound books that had probably never been opened, and their master bedroom suite that was larger than my entire downstairs. Every room was a carefully curated display of wealth and taste, designed to impress and intimidate. The house has been in Charles's family for 4 generations, she explained, running her fingers along the marble mantelpiece in their living room. We've updated it considerably, of course, but we've maintained its historical character. It's beautiful, I said honestly, because it really was. The craftsmanship was exquisite, from the crown moulding to the hardwood floors that gleamed like mirrors. You must feel very fortunate to have such a legacy. Oh, we do, Chloe chimed in, appearing beside us with that bright smile that was becoming increasingly grating. It's part of why Charles and I are so committed to family traditions. We want Andrew to understand what it means to be part of something substantial, something that lasts. The message was clear. Andrew was marrying up, way up, and his little corn-fed family should be appropriately grateful for the elevation in social status. They were offering him membership in their exclusive club, and the price of admission was understanding his place in their hierarchy. That's when I decided to start phase 1 of what I was already thinking of as Project Education. The wedding morning dawned bright and clear, which felt somehow inappropriate for what I knew was going to be one of the most dramatically satisfying days of my life. I'd spent the previous evening double-checking every detail of my plan, while pressing my simple mother of the groom dress, a modest blue ensemble that had cost exactly $89 at JCPenney and would help maintain my carefully crafted image for just a few more hours. What the Pemberton family didn't know was that I'd spent the past week making phone calls that would fundamentally alter their financial landscape. My investment advisor, James Burlington, had been surprisingly helpful once I explained what I wanted to accomplish. It turns out that having $1.2 million in liquid assets opens quite a few doors in the commercial real estate market. But first, I had to survive this wedding without laughing out loud at the sheer audacity of people who thought they could patronize Dorothy Whitman and get away with it. I arrived at the Pemberton estate at 10 in the morning, as requested, carrying a wedding card containing what appeared to be a modest check for $5,000, enough to seem generous from a small-town widow, but not so much as to raise suspicions about my actual financial capacity. What they couldn't see was the additional paperwork in my car that would transfer Andrew from Charles's employee to Charles's business competitor by Monday morning. The estate was buzzing with activity. Florists were arranging what appeared to be $50,000 worth of roses and lilies throughout the grounds. Caterers were setting up stations that could have fed half of Millbrook, and a string quartet was doing sound checks on the terrace, where the ceremony would take place. Patricia was in her element, directing traffic like a general commanding troops, while Chloe glided around in a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, accepting compliments on her upcoming transformation from Pemberton daughter to Pemberton daughter-in-law. "Dorothy," Vivian called, spotting me near the gift table. "How lovely that you're here early." Chloe specifically requested that Andrew's family feel included in all the preparations. Feel included. Right. How thoughtful, I said, placing my card among the collection of envelopes that probably contained enough money to fund a small country's annual budget. "Is there anything I can help with?" "Oh, how sweet of you to offer," Vivian gushed, "but we have everything well in hand. Professional coordination, you understand. We wouldn't want any mishaps on such an important day." Translation: stay out of the way and let the competent people handle things. The ceremony was set to begin at 4 o'clock, giving everyone time to complete their preparations and work themselves into the appropriate emotional state for what Vivian kept calling the social event of the season. I spent the afternoon observing the Pemberton family dynamics with the clinical interest of someone who'd studied her opponents and found them predictably shallow. Charles held court with other wealthy guests, discussing business deals and golf games, while Vivian showed off her daughter's elaborate wedding dress to anyone who would listen. The dress was a work of art, layers of silk and lace that probably cost more than most people's cars. Chloe herself was the picture of bridal perfection, floating through the preparations like a princess who'd never doubted that the world would arrange itself around her desires. None of them paid much attention to Andrew's simple small-town mother, sitting quietly in her corner, wearing her modest department store dress, and watching everything with the kind of patient attention that comes from knowing exactly how a story is going to end. At 3:45, I took my designated seat in the front row, family section naturally, but carefully positioned so that I wouldn't interfere with the photographer's shots of the important relatives. The string quartet began the processional music, and I watched my son take his place at the altar, looking like a man who was about to commit his life to a family that saw him as a charity project rather than an equal partner. That's when Vivian Pemberton made the mistake that would cost her family everything they thought they owned. She was standing near the gift table, chatting with her sister about wedding expenses, when she spotted me in my front row seat. I watched her expression change as she took in my modest dress, my simple hairstyle, my complete lack of obvious wealth or social status. Her face twisted into that particular expression of disdain that wealthy people wear when they encounter something they consider beneath them. And then she said the words that sealed her family's fate, speaking just loud enough for several nearby guests to hear clearly. "Look at that poor thing," Vivian murmured to her sister, nodding in my direction. Sitting there in her little discount dress, trying so hard to look appropriate. That's not a proper mother-in-law. That's a mistake in discount clothes. The words hit me, like a physical slap, but what followed was even more revealing. Chloe, overhearing her mother's comment, as she approached for her final pre-ceremony photos, actually laughed and clapped her hands together, like Vivian had made the most amusing observation of the day. "Mother, you're terrible," Chloe giggled, her voice carrying across the terrace. "But honestly, she does look like she got lost on the way to a church potluck." That's when Andrew, who had been adjusting his boutonniere nearby, went completely still. I watched my son's face change as he processed what his bride and future mother-in-law had just said about his mother. The uncertainty disappeared, replaced by something much harder and more determined than I'd ever seen in his expression. And that's when I knew that maybe, just maybe, I'd raised him right after all. What happened next unfolded like a beautiful, terrible flower, blooming in fast motion. Andrew walked away from the altar, his face set in an expression I'd never seen before, and headed straight for the microphone that had been set up for the ceremony readings. The string quartet faltered to a stop as Andrew tapped the microphone, the sound echoing across the elaborately decorated terrace, where 200 guests had gathered to witness his wedding. "Ladies and gentlemen," Andrew said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence, "I need to make an announcement." Chloe, still holding her bouquet and wearing her $15,000 dress, looked confused rather than alarmed, like this was some kind of romantic surprise she hadn't been informed about. "Andrew, darling," she called out, her voice bright with artificial cheer. "What are you doing? The ceremony is supposed to start." He looked at her for a long moment, and I saw something die in his expression. "Chloe," he said into the microphone, "5 minutes ago, I heard you and your mother discussing my mother's appearance. You called her a mistake in discount clothes and laughed about how she looked like she got lost on the way to a church potluck." The silence that followed was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop on the marble terrace. Chloe's face went white, then red, then white again as she realized that half of Millbrook's social elite had just heard her exposed as the petty, cruel person she actually was. "My mother raised me alone after my father died. She's been nothing but gracious and supportive about this wedding. Despite being treated like an unwelcome charity case by your family, I can't marry someone who would mock my mother, and I can't join a family that thinks cruelty is entertaining. So I'm calling off this wedding right here, right now." That's when Charles Pemberton made his own crucial mistake, stepping forward with rage written across his face. "You ungrateful little nobody," Charles snarled. "We've given you everything, a job, a future, acceptance into our family. And this is how you repay us?" And that's when I decided it was time to stop being invisible. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my discount dress, and walked toward the microphone with calm dignity. "Charles," I said pleasantly, "you're right that control is important in business relationships. That's why I spent this week purchasing your stake in the Riverside Shopping Center development project through my company, Whitman Investment Properties." The color drained from Charles's face, like someone had pulled a plug. "I'm talking about my $1.2 million investment portfolio," I continued, addressing the stunned crowd, "which now owns controlling interest in several local commercial developments, including the ones you've been counting on for your retirement funding." I turned back, Charles with a smile. "You see, you were right about one thing. I do have limitations. My limitation is that I don't tolerate people who mistake kindness for weakness or modesty for stupidity." 3 months later, I was sitting in the executive conference room of Whitman Investment Properties, watching Andrew conduct a business meeting with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you own the building you're sitting in. The Pemberton family had quietly sold their estate and moved to a smaller home across town. Charles's businesses struggled as their financing became more expensive and their prime locations were suddenly controlled by their former charity case. As I drove home through the streets of Millbrook, I passed the former Pemberton estate, now owned by a lovely young family who actually appreciated their good fortune. Sometimes people create their own consequences, and the kindest thing you can do is step aside and let those consequences unfold naturally. Dorothy Whitman had proven that underestimating quiet strength was the most expensive mistake the Pemberton family had ever made. And honestly, that felt like exactly the right ending.